Hello, everybody. Welcome back to PyLadies Con. I hope your time here has been great so far, and I'm excited to welcome our next keynote speaker, Imogen Wright. Is a South African software engineer and bioinformatician who has spent the last 2 decades trying to make complex systems behave in theoretical physics, HIV drug resistance, and COVID genomics, healthcare communications, cloud technologies, and even EdTech. They studied computer science and physics at Rhodes University, completed a master's in theoretical physics at the Perimeter Institute, and this is exciting news, where Stephen Hawking was guest of honor at their graduation. And they earned a PhD in bioinformatics from the University of Western Cape. Imogen co-founded Hyrax Biosciences, where Exotype software helps track HIV drug resistance across Africa, and assembled the first Omicron variant SARS-CoV-2 genomes. Their work has been recognized by the Innovation Prize for Africa, various publications, 2 patents, and a long list of disasters that now fuel their favorite stories. Welcome, Imogen. We're honored to have you here.
Hi, and thank you for the fulsome introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really grateful. Can you see my screen? Is all good? There we go. Great. Thank you so much. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself, even though Marietta's already done such a wonderful job. My name is Imogen. My pronouns are they, them. And today's talk won't be very technical. I read through all of your bios and decided people who carry so much collective responsibility might need a break and a laugh and some humanity. So while I'm totally going to teach you a little bit about complex systems, that's not what this talk is about. Instead, I'm going to tell you a really weird story about what happened after I decided at 25 to try to make the world better with computers. And trust me, it will not be the pretty, sanitized, triumphant version. Things are going to get rough. You should know that I'm half English and half South African, and these stories will meander a lot between both countries. There will also be sarcasm. It's my cultural birthright. Also, while I'm endlessly grateful for gainful employment, the adventure we're about to go on and any thoughts I might share about it are entirely my own. I think I ended up where I ended up because, like many of you listening, I was unfortunately labeled a smart kid in school. And like many smart kids, I grew up terrified that if I stopped being smart, I would somehow instantly disappear. So I double majored in computer science and physics when I got to university because I figured that was a good way to keep existing. I really enjoyed both until my final year, when computer science stopped being about esoteric algorithms and started to be about designing imperfect real-world systems that I realized I would one day have to operate. In particular, I encountered this man's work. His name is Richard Cook, and his biography lists him as a safety researcher, a physician, an anesthesiologist, a university professor, and a software engineer. He's been described as someone who exemplifies intellectual punk rock, which is about the highest compliment I've ever heard of. His work was also heavily quoted in an otherwise fairly dull systems design course I took in my final year of university. This was in an era where systems design meant learning how to draw perfect UML diagrams and not much else. Probably his most famous output is this: how complex systems fail. And it really pissed me off. One thing smart kids don't do is fail, and I was having none of it. I realized that if I wanted to be a practitioner in software development, I'd have to deal with real messy systems with all their pressures and catastrophes. As Richard says, complex systems are intrinsically hazardous systems, and I wasn't sure I was up to hazards. I'm also honestly not sure whether it was Richard Cook or the UML that was the final nail in the coffin, but I decided that messy systems weren't for me and trotted off to Canada to do a master's in theoretical physics instead. There, I set to work on a thesis modeling something called a diblock copolymer. Don't worry, I will explain. Diblock copolymers have a hydrophobic side. That's a side that really hates water. and a hydrophilic side that is really attracted to water. Water for these things is kind of like a bad boyfriend you can't get rid of. These molecules are really simple, but they do super fascinating things when you put them in water. In short, they spontaneously arrange so that the hydrophilic side is near the water and the hydrophobic side is protected from the water. What's even wilder is that they do this in phases, forming sheets, cylinders, and spheres as the temperature of the system goes from cold to hot. I was studying these things as GPUs were just starting to be general purpose, and boy, did I miss a career opportunity there. In particular, I was super interested in modeling on GPUs what would happen when you put some of these diblock copolymers into a cylindrical nanopore. And I did some simulations of that. Here's one of them. What you're watching as these concentric cylinders form is one of the most basic examples of the phenomenon of self-assembly in complex systems. In fact, a diblock copolymer melt, which is what this is, forms one of the simplest complex systems. To explain what I mean by that, I need to define a complex system from a physics perspective very quickly. Complex systems have many interacting parts, and the state of the whole is not trivially reducible to the rules governing those parts. Simple example, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to describe the turbulent flow, oh, that slide didn't work, of Niagara Falls just by understanding the interactions between water molecules. Complex systems are also nonlinear. Small changes can sometimes produce unexpectedly large results. For example, ice is solid and stable at minus 100 Fahrenheit, also at minus 50 Fahrenheit, also at 0 Fahrenheit. Then suddenly, in just a few degrees, around 32 Fahrenheit, it becomes liquid water. Complex system self-assembly, not unlike the kind you see in diblock copolymers, is what forms cell membranes, the most essential building block of complex life. It also lets cells know whether to be kidneys or brains and lets plants grow towards the sun. It's often called, sometimes quite disparagingly by people in other branches of physics, a theory of everything. Unfortunately for me, while those two laws sound super intuitive, if you want to actually do something with them, as I found out during my master's, the work ends up looking a bit like this. These are actual pages from my master's thesis. I realized that while I loved learning about theoretical physics, actually doing it for a living often feels like doing your taxes every day for the rest of your life and mostly getting them wrong. They say that a really successful theoretical physicist has 2 good work days in their career, and that did not sound like good odds to me. I did get to meet Stephen Hawking at my graduation, though. I've mostly put this photo in to show you how much my hairstyle choices have improved since then. After I graduated, I went back home to Cape Town and, not knowing what to do except not physics, reached out to some recruiters. One said I might be a good fit for a job at Amazon, which I found super confusing because I was a mathematician and Amazon was, to my knowledge, an online bookstore. It was only when I rocked up at the interview that I realized that some crazy South Africans had convinced Amazon to sell some of its compute capacity to other people through something they were calling the cloud. I don't know why they hired me when I had no idea what they actually did, but somehow, completely by accident, I became SDE number 30 at Amazon EC2. I had a great time at EC2. I fell in love with tech, and I finally ended up at a senior role in a super fun ad tech startup in London during the kind of golden era of London startups. Cash was flowing, people were getting funded off pitches on the back of napkins, and it probably says a lot about my generally worrying nature that the sudden ease made me more worried than anything. What was I actually doing? The comfort of the Web 2.0 bubble gave me a minute to start thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. An enormous boon and a massive risk. I got really interested in the work of an ethicist called Peter Singer. He went on to be one of the saner voices in something called the effective altruism movement, but he is still, by most human standards, a fairly radical person. At this point, I was 25 and aimless, and Peter's ideas catapulted me into a brand of utilitarian altruism I now see as pretty cringeworthy. But that is, for better or worse, very common among the Silicon Valley Burning Man crowd to this day. My battle cry was this: I will maximize my utility to all living beings. Please forgive me, I was young. Pretty much the most utilitarian thing I could think of to work on was this: That blue stuff is your T cells, and those yellow things there are HIV. As a queer person and a South African, I'd had a front row seat to the pandemic. So I went back to South Africa and started a PhD, working on building software to help with HIV drug resistance testing. I ended up co-founding a company called Hyrax Biosciences, a startup with the grand mission of providing the software platform for affordable HIV drug resistance testing to everyone who was HIV positive in the world. What followed were some of the most rewarding and successful years of my life, as we tried to convince people first that HIV drug resistance was a real problem, and second, that it was worth spending money on. We only partially succeeded, but at least we knew we were fighting a good fight, and I got to meet some pretty interesting people. This is us hanging out at the AIDS conference with the notorious BHG himself in about 2016. At the time, viral genetics was a pretty niche field, but my hair had gotten a lot better. It would take a few more years before viruses would start totally dominating the news. I can remember this article landing firmly in my inbox on my first day back at work in 2020. It kicked off a massive scramble in the virus community to understand how fast the then brand new SARS-CoV-2 virus would spread and for how many people it would be fatal. Even many virologists in January and February 2020 thought the whole thing was just a flash in the pan. The first conclusive study came out towards the end of February. R0 means each person infects 2 people. Infected fatality rate means 0.5% of people die. I plugged those 2 numbers at my desk on a Friday afternoon into a fatality model that they'd used for swine flu and realized that COVID-19 was set to be the 6th biggest cause of death in human history. In reality, by the way, it was the 8th, with 27 million excess deaths, more or less. If anyone tries to tell you the scientific community overreacted to COVID, please send them this slide. The next 2 years were even more stressful than the years that had preceded them. Hyrax built a COVID variant typing tool before there were any COVID variants. And when the beta variant was discovered, we went from feeling like we'd royally wasted our time to being, for the first time, overwhelmingly in demand. I worked harder than I've ever worked while stuck in my house, unable to look away from COVID as it spread around the world. If you remember, I wasn't a person who particularly liked hazards, and here I was in the eye of the technical storm of a pandemic. It wasn't good for the soul. When South Africa finally opened up in November 2021, I decided I needed a break, and I headed to Rome to see a friend. I ate a lot of pasta and gelato, and had just almost relaxed when I got a panicked work phone call. My CEO apologized 6 times for interrupting a much-needed mental health break, and then told me that the core genotyping software I'd built, the engine that powered Hyrax, was returning incorrect COVID DNA sequences with way too many mutations in them. You can't describe the limits of my horror at this statement. Our software runs largely on computers in labs with no access to the internet, and calling the wrong DNA mutations can be life and death. So I ran back to my room and sat literally on the bedroom floor while I debugged what had happened. It turns out the sequences were right, to my massive relief. What I didn't know at the time was that I was staring at what turned out to be the first tranche of sequences from a new COVID variant that would later be called Omicron. Our public health partners were able to present their findings on the new variant to President Cyril Ramaphosa, the masked up king himself, from which they were disseminated to public health bodies around the globe. By the 25th of November, Omicron had been detected in 9 countries, most outside Africa. Also on the 25th of November, the UK imposed a travel ban. Despite the detection of Omicron in those 9 countries, their travel ban was limited to 6 African countries, of which 4 had detected no Omicron cases. On the 27th of November, 2 more Omicron cases were detected in the UK, and their response was to ban travel to 4 more African countries, none of which had any Omicron cases. The US banned travel to a similar set of countries on the 29th of November. By the 7th of December, the Omicron detection map looked like this. And the banned list, well, it looked like this. The West simply couldn't believe that the reason we detected Omicron was precisely because we knew how to look. The ban was finally lifted on the 14th of December, but the untold damage to these countries' reputations, tourism industries, and GDPs had been done. There's a telling irony here. It's not widely known that the original detection of Omicron in Botswana was in samples from international diplomats. The Botswanan lab had refused to release the country of origin of the diplomats out of fear of turning the issue into a geopolitical one. I will mention that our president recently suggested that Africa frequently suffers because it is too reasonable. If you were to take a photo of the inside of my mind at the end of this saga, it would look something like this. I set out naively to maximize my utility to humanity, and I'd never felt like more of a failure. I was not unaware that politicized racism and xenophobia existed, but to see probably still the biggest scientific discovery I'll ever help make turn into a cynical political tool overnight was soul-crushing. In retrospect, I think that despite a lot of fancy degrees, I didn't really understand complex systems. Complex systems are open systems. If you redraw boundaries, gain becomes loss. South Africa put enormous energy into public health science, but we couldn't stop the state of the broader political system turning towards old colonial ideas of otherness and infection. I realized that maximizing my utility wasn't really possible in such a complex system. I'd find a local maximum at best, and who knows what I'd unbalance on the way. But I didn't give up hope that I could have a positive impact. Instead, I revised my intentions and decided a career change was in order. No more CTO title, no more geopolitical importance. I just wanted to be an engineer again. I just wanted to be useful. One thing I developed during COVID, along with most people, was an even more boundless respect for frontline healthcare workers. So I decided to help them practically by going to work as an engineer for the company that made NHS primary care communication apps. The theory was that if you could get healthcare comms to work, you could get healthcare to work. The breath of fresh air was enormous. I loved my colleagues. I loved not being the boss. I loved the fact that the world was opening up again after COVID. Unfortunately, that last one had some personal side effects. After dodging COVID for the whole of 2020 and 2021, I got it 4 times in 2022 and 2023. It turns out I was one of the hypersusceptible people we've been trying to help through social distancing, or that COVID was taking its revenge on me. I'm not sure which. The first 3 times I got COVID were just awful, but the 4th time nearly killed me. After I'd been ill for 6 weeks, I phoned a GP and asked if there was anything they could do. The burnt out GP burst out laughing and said no. And to be clear, I do not blame this person one bit. I developed pneumonia and severely constricted breathing. Finally, I phoned an ambulance, which mercifully after about an hour arrived. After being assessed, the paramedics told me that my oxygen levels weren't quite low enough to be taken to hospital in the ambulance, so I'd have to get out and call an Uber. I dutifully did so, arrived at hospital, and was triaged into the most urgent queue. I waited in that queue for more than 9 hours before, despite still suffocating, I gave up, too exhausted and foggy to keep sitting, and stumbled out. I woke up in the middle of the next night, completely unable to breathe. I remember the kind of resignation I felt, but somehow I kept fighting for breath and was able to take one, then another, then another. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, and I'm so glad I survived. I'd worked so hard for years in my small way to make healthcare work, and yet it has totally failed me when I was at my most vulnerable. I wasn't alone either. Here's a recent Guardian headline. In 2019, 1,000 people in the UK waited over 12 hours for emergency care. In 2025, 116,000 people waited over 12 hours, and that's not counting people who left. This looks like a very short period of time for a collapse, but the NHS has been underfunded for much longer than that. Remember that complex systems are non-linear. A system can work reasonably well under degrading conditions for a really long time before it seemingly suddenly breaks. I'd also forgotten another law of complex systems. Complex systems obey entropy. If you want to maintain a complex system, you need to be pouring energy into it pretty much constantly. Oh dear, this graph is not appearing. No, it is. Unfortunately, the NHS probably isn't getting that right now. As of the last budgets, King's Fund report says the NHS funding is likely to grow 2.4% year on year. To keep the NHS functioning as it is today, which to be clear, isn't the best, we need that to be around 3 to 4%. To achieve real recovery, we'd need closer to 5% annual spend growth. The system is changing phase from working to broken, and we aren't putting enough energy in to stop it. So where did that leave me with my original mandate? I felt I'd actually managed to be useful this time. Helping doctors reach patients is super important, but I still felt like I'd failed. Honestly, staring into the belly of the beast of a declining system had burnt me out, and the ravages of COVID had left me unable to read, think logically, or recognize objects that were right in front of me. I had to change gear completely and just be for a while. I lived from nap to nap for around a year. I thought a lot about plants during this time. Plants are, at the micro level, far more evolved than humans. They have more complicated genomes and more complicated cellular structures. They also convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. They're very useful. And all of this is to ensure that they can just sit and soak up the sun. Unable to face any more frontline public health work, I decided to take inspiration from plants and go back to my roots and the root system of the internet. Every public health initiative I'd worked on had depended on the cloud. So I hung up my frontline helmet and returned to EC2, this time as a senior engineer. The cloud had gotten a lot bigger since the last time I looked, and I was quite overwhelmed when I rejoined. Luckily, I had an awesome technical mentor, but I was initially horrified when one of the first things he threw my way was this: how complex systems fail. I read it with new eyes this time, though. My desire to help, to change the world for the better, had brought me face to face with exactly the intrinsically hazardous systems I desperately tried to avoid. And I suddenly realized that all along, I hadn't really been failing. I'd just been actually trying. And trying always includes a certain amount of failure. Richard Cook's style of intellectual punk rock had captured everything I'd learned better than I ever could. Richard uses the word safety a lot, but I've swapped it out in the following slides with resilience, which I think is a broader and deeper version of exactly what he was going for. Resilience is a global, not a local property of systems. Lots of very not resilient people, including myself, have managed to make resilient systems. Systems like the NHS are often breaking under the surface for a long time before they break noticeably, making root cause a fallacy. Systems aren't separate from the people who interact with them. The system we need to think about should include the person who uses it, operates it, or lives within it. And finally, people continuously create resilience. A lot of the work I do at EC2 is around availability, and that work isn't super flashy. It's mostly quiet maintenance, making things 1% better at a time. I've learned that our seemingly inconsequential efforts in favor of constant renewal are, over time, what keeps the system working. I could be even broader here. I've been intentionally avoiding that word that starts with A and ends with I during this talk, because we could probably all use a break from thinking about that too. But I will say this: our future, like our past, will be made by creative human beings interacting as parts of complex, man-made and natural systems. We need to keep the humans inside the system boundary every time we do a calculation, or the system's gain may be our loss. And while I've learned we can't single-handedly make systems resilient ourselves, we can choose the local rules that we obey, with the intention of creating conditions of resilience. Archetypes are a fun way to think about local rules that humans operate, and I think that as a species, we're stuck in the wrong ones. My journey has taught me that the last archetype we need right now is the hero, but we don't need hermits either. We need a whole new or very old class of human, entirely focused on the actions that encourage resilience and renewal: caring, feeding, watering, and pruning. We need people who quietly notice small changes, knowing they can signal big ones. We need people who tend locally instead of trying to remake the world. And we need people who champion diversity and know monoculture is death. I didn't think there would be anything past my desire to just be. But while I have enormous respect for plants, it turns out that I don't want to become one. As Richard said, we can't create resilience, but we can, with careful tending, create the environments where resilience arises. There's one archetype that I'd like to bring to primacy in all of your minds as a set of rules for how to interact with the world. And that's the gardener. I could introduce her further, but considering what I've seen at this conference, I think you all know her already. Maybe tech and poetry don't mix, but I'd like to leave you with a poem anyway, from Mark Nepo. There are the irritations that rub into a pearl. So we can talk a while, but then we must listen, the way rocks listen to the sea. And we can churn at all that goes wrong, but then we must lay all distractions down and water every living seed. Thank you very much.
Woo, thank you so much, Imogen, for this amazing keynote. I'm imagining if we have a real stage, everybody's like giving you applause. And I can see on Discord there's a lot of applause there. Really, thank you so much. It's a really powerful and inspiration. Thank you for the work you've done. I don't know if we got question, if we have time for questions. I did see one question, if you could answer. The question is, you showed a lot of steps in your life doing different things. Anything you would like to skip or do differently if you were to start again?
It's a difficult one because there are points where I probably suffered unnecessarily, and everyone would prefer to not suffer unnecessarily. But I think I stand at a place in my life that I couldn't possibly have arrived at if all of that hadn't happened. And I'm just really grateful for the variety of experience. I would prefer to have not suffocated. That would have been good. But the variety of experience has been incredible. And I'm really grateful for everyone I worked with and everything that we did manage to do, even in the face of things we didn't.
Thank you. I see a lot of people typing on Discord. I think there might be even more. Lots of people are saying incredible, lots of applauses.
I'll come chat on Discord afterwards.
Okay, yeah, all right, everybody, Imogen will be on Discord. All right, with that, thank you so much, Imogen. Again, it's really we're really honored to have you here. So we're so grateful that you have spent time being with our community. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.